Several conversations
There's a
about
conversation with you
with Harry
about how dark your baby is going to be?
potentially and what that would mean or look like.
Prince Harry broke years of silence in February, and what he revealed shocked the world. Not anger, but raw truth about a marriage under impossible pressure and the crushing weight of choosing between love and duty. What he said next changed everything. But was speaking out his biggest mistake or his only escape? Stay with us to find out. The day silence stopped being safe. The morning of February 2nd, 2026, began like any other, but for Prince Harry, it marked the moment when staying quiet became more dangerous than speaking out. For months, the world had been watching him disappear. No interviews, no photographs, no smiles at charity events, or waves from car windows. Every invitation was declined. Every reporter's question went unanswered. And every mention of Meghan was met with complete silence. At first, people thought he was protecting his family. That made sense. Harry had always been private about the things that mattered most. But as weeks turned into months, the silence stopped feeling like protection. It started feeling like something else entirely. Something was wrong. Inside the walls of the palace, concern was growing. Not the polite, formal kind that gets mentioned in careful meetings. This was deeper, more personal. Senior members of the family were genuinely worried. They saw the signs everyone else missed: weight loss, the exhaustion in his eyes during the rare moments he was seen, the way he seemed to be carrying something too heavy to name. Behind closed doors, conversations began. Quiet ones, careful ones. People who had known Harry his entire life started asking questions they were afraid to answer. Was he eating? Was he sleeping? Was he okay? His mental health became a whispered topic in hallways and private studies. His physical condition was noted by staff who had watched him grow up. He looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He looked sad in a way that time could not heal. But nobody knew how to reach him. At the same time, another story was quietly unfolding. Meghan, once so visible and vibrant, had also pulled back from the world. Friends said she seemed distant, alone. Some even whispered that she felt cut off not just from the royal family, but from Harry himself. The distance between them was growing, though neither would admit it. They were living in the same house, sharing the same life, but somehow existing in separate worlds. The connection that once felt unbreakable now felt strained, fragile. And Harry felt it all. He was trapped between two impossible choices. On one side was Meghan, the woman he had chosen, the mother of his children, the person he had left everything behind to protect. On the other side was a past he could not escape. Memories of his mother, the weight of being a prince, the family he had walked away from but never stopped loving. Loyalty pulled him in one direction, pain pulled him in another, and silence seemed like the only way to survive both. But silence has a cost. It builds walls where there should be bridges. It turns small misunderstandings into massive resentments. It lets fear grow in the dark until it becomes too big to face. Harry felt those walls closing in. Every day, he woke up knowing he was hiding something. Not a secret, not a scandal, just the truth of how he actually felt. And every day, that truth became harder to carry. He stopped answering calls from people who cared about him. He avoided conversations that might lead somewhere real. He smiled when he had to and disappeared when he could. He became an expert at being present without actually being there. People around him noticed. Palace staff who had served him for years saw the change. Childhood friends reached out and got nothing back. Even his brother, despite everything that had happened between them, felt the distance and did not know how to bridge it. And Meghan, though she stood beside him, could feel him slipping away. She asked him if he was okay. He said yes. She asked if they were okay. He said of course, but his words felt empty. Automatic, like he was reading from a script he no longer believed in. The truth was, Harry did not know how to explain what was happening inside him. He did not have the words for the heaviness that followed him everywhere. He could not name the feeling of being lost even when surrounded by people who loved him. So he stayed quiet and hoped the feeling would pass. But it did not pass. It grew. Until one morning, sitting alone in a room that suddenly felt too small, Harry realized something that terrified him. The silence was not protecting anyone anymore. It was hurting everyone, including himself. He thought about his children, about what kind of father he wanted to be, about what kind of man he wanted them to see when they looked at him. He thought about his mother and what she would say if she could see him now. And he thought about Meghan, really thought about her. Not as someone he needed to protect or defend, but as a person he was supposed to share his life with. A person who deserved honesty, even when the truth was hard. That morning, something shifted inside him. A decision formed, quiet but firm. He could not keep living like this. He could not keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly was not. He could not keep choosing silence when silence was slowly destroying him. So Harry made a choice, a private one. One he did not announce or explain to anyone yet. He decided to speak, not to the world, not to the press, not in some grand public statement, just to one person. In one honest conversation, about everything he had been holding back. The words he could not take back. Harry had rehearsed nothing. That was the first mistake, or perhaps the only honest choice he had left. He sat across from someone he trusted, someone who had known him long enough to recognize when he was breaking. The room was small and private, no cameras, no recording devices, just two people and a conversation that was supposed to stay between them. But the moment Harry started talking, something happened that he had not anticipated. The words he had been holding back for months, maybe years, came pouring out, not in careful sentences, not in polished statements, but in raw, unfiltered truth. He did not plan to say half of what he said. He did not mean to go that deep, but once he started, he could not stop. Harry talked about fear, the kind that wakes you up at night and follows you through the day. The fear of failing as a husband, as a father, as a man trying to protect the people he loved while the whole world watched and judged and waited for him to fall apart. He talked about exhaustion, not the tired you feel after a long day, but the kind that settles into your bones and makes everything feel impossible. The exhaustion of constantly defending, constantly explaining, constantly trying to prove that his choices were right when he was not even sure anymore. He talked about pressure, the crushing weight of being a symbol when all he wanted was to be human, of being expected to represent something bigger than himself when he could barely hold himself together. And then he talked about his marriage, not with anger, not with blame, but with a sadness so deep it filled the room. Harry spoke Meghan's name carefully, gently, like he was handling something precious that had already started to crack. He loved her, that much was clear in every word. But love, he was learning, did not always mean understanding. And protection did not always mean closeness. He admitted something that hurt to say out loud, that in trying to protect her from everything, he had lost parts of himself, that somewhere along the way, he stopped being Harry and became only a shield, a defender, a spokesperson for decisions that were made around him, not always by him. He talked about watching things unfold and feeling powerless to change them, about wanting to speak up but not knowing if his voice even mattered anymore, about feeling caught between the life he chose and the life that was choosing him. There were no accusations, no attacks on Meghan or the royal family, no dramatic revelations meant to shock, just honesty. Painful, complicated, messy honesty about what happens when two people love each other but cannot seem to find their way back to each other. He spoke about the distance that had grown between them, how they could be in the same room and still feel miles apart, how conversations became shorter, silences became longer, and connection became something they both wanted but could not quite reach. Harry did not blame her. He made that clear. This was not about fault. It was about what happens when two people are under too much pressure for too long. When the world demands too much and gives back too little. When love is still there but gets buried under everything else. The person listening did not interrupt, did not ask questions, just let Harry speak until he had nothing left to say. And when he finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different. Lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted, even though Harry knew the consequences were only beginning. He left that room believing the conversation would stay there. That was the agreement, that was the understanding. This was private, this was safe. But the world has a way of finding secrets, especially the ones that matter most. Within hours, whispers started. Not from the person Harry trusted, not intentionally, but words have a way of traveling, of slipping through cracks, of reaching ears they were never meant for. By the next morning, people inside the palace knew something had happened. They did not have details, not yet, but they could feel the shift. The change in the air that happens when truth starts to surface. Reactions came swiftly and split cleanly down the middle. Some saw Harry's words as betrayal, as weakness, as a failure to protect the institution and the family he was born into. They worried about what this meant, about what damage could be done, about what the public would think if any of this became known. Others saw something entirely different. They saw honesty. The first real, unguarded moment Harry had allowed himself in years. They saw a man finally admitting that he was struggling instead of pretending everything was fine. And some, quietly, felt relief that someone was finally telling the truth. But inside the royal family, panic began to spread, not because of what Harry had said, but because of what he might still say. If he had opened up once, he could do it again. If he had admitted this much, what else was he holding back? And most terrifying of all, if this conversation somehow became public, how could they possibly control it? Meetings were called, strategies were discussed, damage control plans were drafted just in case. The family that valued silence above almost everything else suddenly realized that silence was no longer an option. Harry had opened a door, and no matter how hard anyone tried, it could not be closed again. He did not know that yet. He went home that evening feeling lighter than he had in months, believing he had finally done something right, believing he had taken one small step toward healing. He did not know that his words were already moving beyond his control, that the conversation meant to stay private was becoming something much bigger, that the truth he had shared in a moment of vulnerability was about to change everything. Harry had spoken honestly for the first time in a long time, and now, whether he was ready or not, the world was about to respond. When the truth became a threat. The palace did not sleep that night. Lights stayed on in rooms that were usually dark by midnight. Phones rang constantly. Doors opened and closed as advisors rushed between offices, their faces tight with worry. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. By morning, the scramble had begun. Senior aides gathered in private conference rooms, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Strategies were mapped out on paper and then immediately discarded. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt safe. Because this time the problem was not a scandal they could deny or a rumor they could silence. This time, the problem was the truth. And truth, they were quickly realizing, was much harder to control. Nobody knew exactly what Harry had said, not word for word. But enough details had leaked to cause panic. He had spoken about his marriage, about feeling lost, about pressure and exhaustion and the weight of trying to be something he was not sure he could be anymore. That alone was dangerous. But what terrified the institution most was not what Harry had already said. It was what he might say next. Meetings stretched late into the night. The same conversations happened over and over in different rooms with different people, but always with the same conclusion. They had to contain this, quickly, quietly, before it became something they could not manage. Plans were drafted, responses were prepared. Strategies were discussed about how to frame the situation, how to protect the family's image, and how to make sure Harry's words did not spiral into something bigger. But beneath all the planning was something darker: fear. Real, genuine fear that they were losing control of a situation they had always been able to manage before. And then the old wounds began to open. Prince William heard about the conversation. Not all of it, just enough to know that Harry had spoken openly about things that were supposed to stay private, things that affected the entire family, not just him. The distance between the brothers, already vast, seemed to grow even wider. There was no phone call, no attempt to reach out and understand. Just silence. Cold, heavy silence that said more than words ever could. Years of unresolved tension came rushing back. Old arguments, old betrayals, old pain that had never properly healed. The rift that began when Harry chose to leave deepened with every passing hour. Trust, already fragile and barely holding, began to crack. Inside the palace, some advisors started suggesting a different approach. Not anger, not confrontation, but concern. They began framing Harry's honesty as a sign that something was wrong, that he was struggling, that perhaps he needed help. It sounded kind, caring even. But Harry sensed something else beneath it. They were using his vulnerability as a weapon, turning his honesty into evidence that he was unwell, that he could not be trusted to speak for himself, that he needed to be protected, which really meant controlled. Health concerns were mentioned in carefully worded statements. Mental well-being became a topic of quiet discussion. Not because they genuinely cared, Harry realized, but because it gave them leverage, a way to dismiss what he said, a way to paint his words as the result of exhaustion or stress rather than truth. It was concern disguised as care, and it made Harry feel more trapped than ever. He had walked away from the institution years ago, left the country, built a new life. But the system he was learning still believed it owned him, still believed it had the right to control his voice, his story, his silence. And that realization made something shift inside him. While the palace scrambled to contain the damage, another storm was quietly building. Meghan felt exposed in a way she had not anticipated. Harry's honesty, though spoken with love, had unintentionally put her in a spotlight she did not want. His words about their marriage, about the distance between them, about losing himself while protecting her, were now being discussed by people who had never supported her in the first place. Friends close to Meghan began asking questions, gentle ones at first. "Are you okay? Did you know he was going to say this? How do you feel about it?" But beneath the kindness was doubt, uncertainty about whether Harry's truth was helping or hurting, whether his honesty protected her or placed her under an even harsher lens. Some wondered if he had spoken without thinking about how it would affect her. Others questioned whether his version of events matched hers. And a few, though they would not say it out loud, began to worry that Harry was changing, pulling away, becoming someone they did not recognize. Meghan said nothing publicly, but privately, the questions hurt, because she did not have answers. She did not know why Harry had opened up to someone else instead of her. She did not know what he was feeling because he had stopped telling her months ago. The distance between them, the same distance Harry had spoken about, was now impossible to ignore. And while they struggled in private, the world outside was getting louder. Rumors began to spread. Not all at once, not in headlines, but in whispers, in carefully placed leaks to journalists who knew how to read between the lines, in strategic comments from unnamed sources close to the family, half-truths mixed with speculation, facts blurred with fiction. And slowly, a narrative began to form, one that painted Harry as unstable, Meghan as isolated, their marriage as troubled. None of it was entirely false, but none of it was entirely true either. It was the kind of story that benefited those who wanted to control the conversation, the kind of story that made Harry look weak and Meghan look difficult. And Harry saw it happening. He watched the narrative being built around him, brick by brick, leak by leak. He recognized the tactics because he had seen them used before, against his mother, against Meghan, and now against him. He realized something in that moment that changed everything. Speaking once was not enough. If he stopped now, If he stayed silent again, others would finish the story for him. They would shape it, control it, turn it into something he did not recognize. The institution wanted him to stop talking, to retreat back into silence, to let them manage the situation the way they always had. But Harry understood now that silence had never protected anyone. Not really. It had only protected the system. The image, the carefully maintained illusion that everything was fine. And he was done protecting that illusion. Somewhere in the quiet of his own thoughts, Harry made another decision. One that would change everything that came after. He was going to speak again. Not in vague terms, not in careful diplomatic language that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. He was going to say the one thing the palace could not forgive. The one truth they had spent years trying to bury. He did not know yet what the consequences would be. He did not know if his marriage would survive it, if his family would ever forgive him, if the world would understand. But he knew he could not stay silent anymore, not when silence had become another form of prison. When love and duty could not coexist. Harry stood at a crossroads he had been avoiding his entire life. On one side was the institution he was born into, on the other was the truth he could no longer carry alone. And in the middle was a choice that felt impossible. For weeks, he had been thinking about his mother, not in the way he usually did, with fond memories or quiet sadness, but with a new understanding that made his chest tight. She had been trapped too, between what she felt and what she was allowed to say, between who she was and who the world needed her to be, between love and duty. And history, Harry realized with growing horror, was repeating itself, not in the same way, not with the same drama, but in quieter, slower, equally damaging ways. He saw the pattern now. The same pressure, the same impossible expectations, the same system that valued image over humanity. And he understood that if he did not break the cycle, it would break him instead. But breaking it meant facing the hardest truth of all. His marriage was struggling, not because the love was gone, but because the pressure had become too much for love alone to carry. Harry and Meghan had spent years standing together against the world, defending each other, protecting each other, choosing each other over everything else. But somewhere in all that fighting, they had stopped actually seeing each other. The distance between them had grown slowly. So slowly that neither of them noticed until it was already too wide to cross easily. They still lived in the same house, still raised their children together, still appeared to the outside world like a united front. But privately, they were living separate struggles in the same space. Harry carried fears he had never spoken out loud. He worried that he had become a burden to Meghan, that his name, his history, his family were weights she had to carry because of him, that she would have been better off, happier, freer, if she had never met him. He feared being the reason she lost her peace, her privacy, her sense of safety in the world. And so he tried to protect her. From the media, from his family, from the constant scrutiny. But in protecting her, he stopped sharing with her. He stopped letting her see his pain because he thought it would only add to hers. Meghan carried her own fears, different but equally heavy. She worried that she had cost Harry everything, his family, his country, his role, his sense of belonging. She saw how he looked sometimes when news came from England, saw the sadness he tried to hide when his brother's name was mentioned, saw the weight of choices made years ago that could never be unmade. She feared being the reason he lost himself, the reason he would one day look back with regret. And so she tried to be strong, to never complain, to never make him feel like leaving had been a mistake. But in being strong, she stopped letting him see her struggles. She stopped asking for what she needed because she thought it would only make things harder. They both suffered silently, each trying to protect the other, neither realizing that the silence itself was the problem. The resentments grew slowly. Not loud, angry ones, but quiet ones that settled like dust over everything. Harry resented carrying the weight of decisions that were made for both of them, but blamed only on him. Meghan resented feeling like she had to be perfect, had to never break, had to always be the strong one. Harry resented the assumption that he was weak for struggling. Meghan resented being painted as the villain in a story she never asked to be part of. They never fought about these things, never screamed or accused. They just grew quieter, more distant, more alone even when they were together. The sacrifices each had made went unspoken and therefore unacknowledged. Harry had given up his family, his country, his role. Meghan had given up her career, her independence, her sense of safety in the world. But neither felt safe enough to say it out loud because saying it felt like admitting failure. And both were terrified of failing each other. Harry finally understood something that broke his heart. Silence had not saved their marriage. It had only delayed the moment when they would have to face what was really happening. All the protecting, all the defending, all the careful avoidance of hard conversations. None of it had helped. It had only created distance where there should have been closeness. He thought about the person he had become, the one who smiled when cameras appeared but felt empty when they left, the one who defended his choices publicly but questioned them privately, the one who said he was fine when he was anything but. That person, Harry realized, was not sustainable. Not for him, not for Meghan, not for their children who deserved parents who were whole, not just holding on. Something had to change, and the only thing Harry could control was his own honesty. He made a decision that night, one that terrified him but also felt strangely freeing. He would speak one final time, not to a trusted friend behind closed doors. Not in vague terms that could be misinterpreted or controlled, but fully, publicly, without protection. He would tell the truth about what the last few years had actually been like. About the marriage everyone thought they understood but nobody really knew. About the pressure that looked like privilege from the outside but felt like drowning from the inside. He would speak about his mother and the patterns he could finally see. About the institution that valued silence over healing. About love that was real but not enough on its own to fix everything. The moment everything changed. The words went public on a Tuesday morning. Not through a formal statement, not in a planned interview, but they went public nonetheless, and the world responded instantly. Harry's truth, raw and unfiltered, spread across headlines within hours. Social media exploded. News channels interrupted regular programming. Everyone had an opinion, and nobody was neutral. The reaction split cleanly down the middle, sharp as a knife. Some people saw courage. They saw a man finally being honest about struggles that millions understood but few had the platform to express. They saw vulnerability in a world that demanded perfection. They praised him for speaking about mental health, about marriage, about the weight of expectations that crush people slowly. Messages of support flooded in. People shared their own stories of feeling trapped, of loving someone but struggling to connect, of carrying pain they could not name. Harry became, for many, a voice for things they had felt but never said. But others saw something entirely different. They saw betrayal, disloyalty, a prince airing private family matters for the world to consume. They accused him of seeking attention, of playing victim, of breaking the unspoken rule that family problems stay behind closed doors. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Critics questioned his motives, his timing, his right to complain when he lived a life of privilege most could never imagine. They said he had chosen to leave the royal family and now wanted sympathy for a situation he created. The divide was not just public, it was personal. Families argued over dinner tables, friends stopped speaking. The country that had once celebrated Harry now seemed split over whether he deserved compassion or criticism. And inside the palace, silence. The royal family did not respond immediately. There was no angry statement, no public rebuttal, just careful, controlled restraint that somehow felt worse than words would have. But privately, the damage was catastrophic. Relationships that were already fragile shattered completely. The distance between Harry and William, once measured in miles, now felt permanent. There would be no reconciliation. Not now. Maybe not ever. Old alliances within the family collapsed. People who had quietly supported Harry from afar could no longer afford to be associated with him. The institution demanded loyalty, and loyalty meant choosing sides. Private conversations that should have stayed private became public through reactions rather than statements. A comment here, a gesture there. The way certain family members looked when Harry's name was mentioned. Everything became evidence of how deep the fracture ran. And through it all, Meghan became a symbol again, not a person, not a wife or mother or woman with her own complex feelings, but a symbol of change, of disruption, of everything people either loved or hated about the modern monarchy. She had spent years trying to escape that role, trying to be seen as human rather than representative of something bigger. But Harry's honesty, though well-intentioned, had put her back in that spotlight she desperately wanted to leave. Harry saw it happening and felt sick with guilt. He had spoken his truth, but in doing so, he had made her truth harder to tell. He had exposed their struggles without asking if she was ready for the world to know. He had protected her for years and then, without meaning to, had made her vulnerable in ways he could not fix. The cost of his honesty was becoming clear, and it was higher than he anticipated. Then the health concerns stopped being whispers and started being real. Harry had lost weight. Everyone could see it now. The exhaustion in his eyes was not something cameras could hide anymore. He looked like a man who had been carrying too much for too long and had finally reached his limit. Doctors were consulted. Quietly, discreetly. But the concern was genuine. Years of emotional suppression had taken a physical toll. The body, it turned out, keeps score even when the mind tries to forget. Meghan was struggling too, though in different ways. The isolation she had felt for years intensified. Friends who had stood by her now seemed uncertain, supportive but cautious, present but distant. Harry watched her navigate it all with a strength that broke his heart, because he knew she should not have to be this strong, should not have to carry this alone. He realized something then that hurt more than any headline or criticism. Telling the truth had not brought peace, not yet, maybe not ever, but it brought clarity. He understood now that some problems do not have solutions. Some fractures cannot be healed. Some choices, once made, cannot be unmade. The family he had hoped to reconcile with was gone. The institution he thought might change had only hardened. The public that he wanted to understand him was divided in ways that felt permanent. And the marriage he had fought so hard to protect was facing a future neither of them had imagined. Harry and Meghan sat together one evening, their children asleep upstairs, the house quiet around them. They did not talk much. There was not much left to say that had not already been said or felt. But they sat together, and that, for now, was something. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind was unrecognizable. Everything looked different now, felt different. The path forward was unclear, and the certainty they once had about their choices was gone. What remains after the truth? The days following Harry's confession did not bring the resolution anyone expected. There was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful reunion, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. There was only aftermath, quiet, heavy, unchanging. The monarchy survived. Of course it did. Institutions like that always survive. They outlast scandals and secrets and family fractures because they are built to endure, not to feel. But something human was lost in the process, something that could not be measured or photographed or reported in headlines. The family bond, already fragile, now felt permanently cold. Not broken in some loud, obvious way, just colder, thinner, like ice that looks solid from a distance but cracks the moment you step on it. Phone calls that used to happen, even if they were brief and awkward, stopped completely. Birthday messages went unsent. Christmas plans did not include reconciliation. The distance that had been growing for years became official, accepted, permanent. Harry felt it most in the silence, not the absence of noise but the absence of connection. He would see news about his family and feel like he was reading about strangers, people he used to know, people he loved once, people who now existed in a world he was no longer part of. And there was no anger left, no bitterness, just a deep, sad acceptance that some things cannot be fixed, no matter how badly you want them to be. Trust, what little remained, had disappeared entirely. Not just between Harry and the institution, but within the institution itself. Everyone was more guarded now, more careful, more aware that private words could become public and loyalty could shift in an instant. The palace moved forward as it always had, with dignity, with composure, with the practiced ability to appear unshaken even when everything inside was fracturing. But Harry knew the truth. They were shaken. They just refused to show it. And slowly, painfully, Harry began to accept something he had resisted for years. Breaking his silence had not fixed the past, had not healed old wounds or repaired broken relationships, had not made his family understand or the world forgive, but it had freed him from living inside the past, from carrying secrets that were too heavy, from pretending everything was fine when it clearly was not. For the first time in years, Harry could breathe without feeling like he was hiding something. He could wake up without the weight of unspoken truth pressing down on him. He could look at himself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. That was not peace, not yet. But it was freedom. And freedom, he was learning, was its own kind of healing. Meghan made a different choice, one that surprised people who thought they knew her. She stepped away from the noise, completely, deliberately. She stopped reading the headlines, stopped responding to criticism, stopped trying to explain herself to people who had already decided what they believed. She chose privacy over explanation, silence over defense, and in doing so, she found something she had been searching for since the beginning: control, not over what people said about her, but over what she allowed to affect her. She spent more time with her children, more time in spaces where cameras could not reach, more time being a person instead of a symbol. And she stopped waiting for the world to understand her, because she realized they never would, not fully, and that was okay. Her relationship with Harry shifted too, slowly, carefully. Like two people learning how to walk together after both had been carrying too much weight for too long. They were no longer defined by defense, by the constant need to protect each other from the world. That exhausting, all-consuming role they had played for years was finally over. Now they were just two people trying to be honest. With the world, with each other, with themselves. It was painful sometimes. Honesty often is. There were hard conversations, moments of doubt, questions neither of them had answers for. But there was also relief. The relief of not pretending anymore, of saying what they actually felt instead of what they thought they should feel. Their marriage was not fixed, but it was real again. Messy and uncertain and human in ways it had not been for a long time. February 2nd, 2026, arrived quietly. A year since the silence had become unbearable. A year since Harry decided he could not live that way anymore. He stood in the same room where everything had started. Not the room where he first spoke his truth, but the room in his own mind where he made the decision to stop hiding. And he understood something now that he had not understood then. Truth is not about shocking the world. It is not about headlines or reactions or making people understand. Truth is simpler than that, quieter. Truth is about finally choosing yourself, about deciding that your peace matters more than their approval, that your honesty matters more than their comfort. Harry had spent his entire life being what other people needed him to be: a prince, a soldier, a rebel, a symbol, a son trying to make up for the one his family lost. But he had never just been Harry, the person beneath all those roles, the one with fears and doubts and struggles that did not fit neatly into any narrative. Now, for the first time, he was choosing to be that person. Not perfectly, not without consequences, but honestly. The world would move on. The family would remain distant. The headlines would eventually fade, but Harry would still be here, finally free from the silence that almost destroyed him, finally able to live with the truth, whatever it cost. And that, he realized, was enough.